Hey, thanks for coming back to HFI Covenant. My name is Jennifer, and I'll be narrating today's story. This is an original human-written work of science fiction, so grab a seat, relax, and let's dive right in. The first slug punched through the school access panel at 900 meters per second, and the sound it made was nothing like the crystalline hum of an energy discharge. It was blunt, percussive. An ugly meat world noise that did not belong in the clean architecture of a research station built for silence. Duncan liked it that way. He moved through the breach before the smoke had finished curling, his bolt-action slug thrower cycling a fresh round with the practiced pull of a man who had done this in worse places than a sterile orbital platform. The school called their facilities observatories. Duncan called them prisons. The difference, he had decided long ago, was purely a matter of whose paperwork you were willing to sign. The corridor was alabaster white, ribbed with faintly luminescent panels that pulsed at regular intervals. Some kind of environmental rhythm the school used instead of clocks. 2 of those panels now had holes in them. The third was on fire. He consulted the schematic burned into his bracer, a hand-drawn overlay lifted from a captured school surveyor's equipment, transcribed in grease pencil because he did not trust anything that could be remotely wiped. The neural mapping labs were 3 levels down, separated from the upper floors by a bulkhead door rated for hard vacuum. It had one mechanical weakness: the hydraulic compression joint on its lower hinge. Duncan had a pry bar for that. A school technician appeared at the far end of the corridor, 7 feet of pale, spindly calculation, its vibration-sensitive skin patches flaring white as it registered the percussion of his entry. It opened its mouth and produced a flat, perfectly rhythmic sequence of tones that Duncan had learned to interpret as an alarm call. He put a round through the wall 2 feet to its left. The school did not flinch. They never flinched, lacking the startle reflex of species that had evolved under active predation. But it did calculate an exit and take it. That was enough. Duncan was not here to kill technicians. He was here to destroy 3 neural mapping relay cores, collect any intelligence he could carry, and leave. He hadn't planned on finding anything that would make him reconsider the leaving part. The station shuddered as his secondary charge, the one he had left on the outer hull, burned through the docking clamp. One less route of reinforcement. The school would already be rerouting. They were nothing if not methodical. Duncan descended. The air changed at the second-level junction, dropping several degrees in a way that had nothing to do with climate control. It was the particular cold of places designed to suppress biological activity. His breath fogged. His knuckles tightened on the grip of his weapon, not from fear, but because the cold always made the old shrapnel scar on his right hand ache. And discomfort had a way of sharpening thought. He was already behind schedule. He did not yet know that what waited below was going to make the schedule irrelevant. The tank was the wrong shape to be a tank. It was the right shape to be a coffin. If coffins were built by beings who understood biological stasis, the way an engineer understands a malfunctioning component, something to be contained and quieted until a use for it could be determined. The chamber it occupied was smaller than the others, set apart from the main neural mapping array by a sealed anteroom that Duncan had to shoulder open when the access panel failed to respond to the spike he drove into it. Inside, the only light came from the tank itself, a faint blue-green bioluminescence emitted by the fluid within, which was not water but something denser, something that moved too slowly when the tank's vibration membrane pulsed. There were tubes. There was a harness. There were monitoring leads attached at 11 points to the body suspended inside. Duncan had been in enough places to know what suffering looked like when it had been going on long enough that the suffering had forgotten its own name. He pressed his face close to the tank's observation surface. The figure within was feline adjacent in the way that a storm is weather adjacent. Technically accurate, missing the point entirely. Copper-toned skin mapped with dark tabby striping along the limbs and spine. Digitigrade legs folded into a posture that was not sleep. Pointed ears held flat and motionless against a skull framed by features that would have been called sharp in a language built for compliments. The eyes were closed. The harness, Duncan noted, was rated for containment, not comfort. He checked the corridor behind him. Clear. He checked his timer, behind schedule and deepening. He drove the pry bar into the tank's seal. The fluid came out first, that slow, dense medium cascading across the floor tiles and soaking into his boots with a cold that was aggressive rather than ambient. Then the harness released as the internal pressure equalized, and the figure inside would have folded to the deck if Duncan had not already positioned himself to catch her. She was lighter than the density of her muscle should have allowed, which told him she had been in there long enough for atrophy to begin. Her body temperature was wrong, too low, far too low, the skin under his hands carrying the chill of something that had been kept very deliberately still. He got her over his shoulder in the carry that field medics called the fireman, and soldiers called the only option. She did not respond. She breathed, which was enough. "All right," Duncan said, because he talked when he was doing something inadvisable, and it helped. "You're not a combatant, and you're not a relay corps, and you are absolutely not on the mission brief. But here we are." He turned for the exit. Behind him, the monitoring leads sparked against the empty harness, reporting vital sign absence to a system that would eventually send something to investigate. He calculated he had approximately 8 minutes before that something arrived. The pry bar went back onto his belt. He was going to need it. The blast door was old. That was, depending on your philosophy, either a significant problem or the only advantage Duncan had. The school built for eternity and then forgot to maintain the parts they considered resolved. The hydraulic door separating the lower research tier from the emergency egress tunnels had been installed during the station's original construction, before the school had decided that energy-based locking systems were more elegant than mechanical ones, and it had not been tested for manual operation in a period Duncan estimated at several decades, based on the oxidation pattern along its lower hinge bracket. Oxidation meant metal fatigue. Metal fatigue meant a place for a pry bar. He set Lanira down against the corridor wall with her spine supported, her head tilted so her airway stayed clear. She was still unconscious, her breathing evening out by degrees as the nullification fluid cleared her system, and the faint striping along her forearms seemed darker in the emergency lighting, rich lines of charcoal against copper, a pattern that belonged somewhere with leaves in it, not fluorescent panels. Duncan had no time to think about that. The station's alarm had graduated from localized to systemic while he was in the anteroom, which meant school correction officers were converging from the docking tier. He had perhaps 4 minutes before the first unit reached this corridor. The blast door's manual release, a recessed lever behind a panel he had to crack open with the flat of his palm, was corroded into uselessness, which left the hinge. He seated the pry bar's head against the compression joint at the lower hinge bracket, found his footing on the deck grating, and pushed. Human physiology, the school data catalogs noted in their taxonomic sections on Terran biology, was the product of a high-gravity world with an unusually dense atmosphere and predator pressure that had never fully resolved in the species' evolutionary history. The result was a creature of inconsistent threat assessment that periodically demonstrated load-bearing and endurance capacity that the Standard Galactic Biological Index classified as anomalous. What the catalog did not include was the sound Duncan made when he put his full weight and the entirety of his Deathworlder musculature into a lever arm against a corroded bracket. The hinge gave, not all at once, first a groan, then a crack propagating through metal that had not moved in 30 years, then a gap that he widened by main force until it was large enough. The door did not open so much as it surrendered. Duncan was breathing hard by the time he had it wide enough, sweat cutting through the residue of the nullification fluid still damp on his jacket. He went back for Lanira. She was heavier on his second carry because he was now operating on the other side of a significant physical output. But this was not the first time Duncan had carried a person through a structure that was actively trying to end both of them, and he had long since made his peace with the distinction between what was possible and what was simply going to happen, regardless. He moved through the door. The tunnel beyond was service-grade, unlit, and blessedly unmonitored. The school had not considered it worth watching, which told Duncan everything he needed to know about how much they valued what was left behind blast doors built for emergencies. Behind him, he heard the flat, rhythmic tones of correction officers reaching the corridor he had just vacated. He kept moving. The cargo shuttle was a school workboat. Boxy, functional, stripped of any feature that could be called comfort on the grounds that the beings who operated it did not require comfort, merely efficiency. It smelled of recycled atmosphere and trace chemical solvents, and its seating was a bench designed for the ergonomic profile of a 7-foot frame with no meaningful adipose tissue. Duncan had stolen worse. He laid Lanira on the bench with his jacket rolled under her head, an accommodation that solved approximately none of the ergonomic problems, but addressed the only one he had any capacity to fix right now, and ran the pre-launch sequence from memory, using a bypass he had learned from a smuggler who was probably dead and whose lessons deserved to outlive him. The shuttle undocked with the soft hydraulic exhale of a system that had not been told to refuse the request. He put the station behind him and set course for the jungle moon he had been using as a staging point. At current burn, it was 7 hours out, which gave him time. He did not know what to do with time, exactly. He did what he always did and checked his equipment, cataloged his expenditure of ammunition, and ate a ration block that tasted like compressed sawdust with nutritional ambitions. Lanira woke 40 minutes into the transit. She came back to consciousness the way something emerges from water, rather than the way something wakes from sleep. All at once and already aware, though her coordination lagged behind her attention. Her large vertical slit eyes opened and found him across the shuttle's narrow cabin, and the quality of her focus was of a creature that had spent long enough in captivity to have learned that waking was a risk assessment before anything else. She did not move, she catalogued. Duncan leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and did not reach toward her because he had grown up with a working dog and had learned early that reaching was something you let the other party decide first. "You're clear of the station," he said. "We're in transit. No pursuit yet." She said nothing. Her ears, he noticed, had come upright, mobile, tracking the ambient sounds of the shuttle's systems with an unconscious precision that made the scan feel involuntary. What happened next was small and significant, in the way that small things are when they change the context of everything around them. Lanira's body, still acclimating after the chill of the nullification tank, registered the ambient temperature of the cabin, and then registered the presence of Duncan's significantly higher thermal output, the 101 degrees that his metabolic persistence radiated as a continuous byproduct of existing. She shifted, not toward him, not precisely, just fractionally, the way a cold thing orients toward warmth without deciding to. Her eyes stayed on his face. Duncan did not comment on it. He offered her a water canteen. She looked at it for a long moment, processing the gesture, he realized, rather than the object. As if generosity were a variable she was attempting to model against known data and finding insufficient precedent for. Her hand came up slowly, and she took it. She spoke in the third hour. Not much. Valari did not waste language the way some species did, filling silence with noise to avoid the confrontation of quiet. But she spoke, and the sound of it was a low, melodic alto that carried a warmth underneath the careful neutrality. Like embers under ash, she asked why he had taken her. Duncan considered being glib about it, because glib was his first reflex in any situation that required honesty. He decided against it. "There's a rule," he said. "Old human thing. No one gets left behind." She considered this. Her ears tilted slightly, not toward a sound, but at an angle he was beginning to associate with active processing. "A tactical doctrine. Sometimes, more like a..." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You ever have someone who just decides you matter? Not because of what you can do for them. Just because you're there and you're in trouble?" The silence that followed was not absence. It had a texture. "No," she said finally. "It's a human thing," he said. "We're bad at leaving people. Evolutionarily speaking, probably a liability." The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. He did not yet know enough of her face's grammar to be sure. But it was something intentional. She watched him eat the second half of his ration block, with the focused attention of someone who had been denied sensory input, for long enough that the act of chewing was interesting. He became aware gradually that she was cataloging his face, not with the flat taxonomic interest of a researcher, but with the specific fascination of a being for whom expressive faces were a novelty. The school had none. Their features were for vibrational sensing, not emotion. Whatever expressions Duncan made when he was tired or thinking or mildly irritated at his own ration bar were, he realized, entirely new information to someone who had spent her captivity in the company of beings who communicated in monotone. "You make many faces," she said. "Occupational hazard. They mean different things. Most of them mean I wish the food tasted better." The trill, when it came, was quiet, barely above the threshold of his hearing, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. But it was unmistakably something in the register of involuntary comfort. She stilled when it happened, as if surprised by her own response. Duncan looked very carefully at the instrument panel. The jungle moon was 4 hours out. Outside the viewport, the transit lane was empty, and the stars were indifferent. And inside the stolen school workboat, the air between them was warmer than the climate controls could fully account for. The jungle moon had a name in 3 different galactic catalogs, none of which Duncan used. He called it the staging point. Lanira, upon seeing the canopy from the shuttle's descent window, a solid ceiling of interlocked bioluminescent growth, lit amber and green beneath the perpetual cloud cover, said nothing, but her ears came fully forward and held there for the duration of approach. He took it as a positive sign. They had been on the surface for 6 hours when the correction officers arrived. Duncan had set perimeter alerts, low-tech tripwires rigged with chemical indicators, the kind that did not emit a signal that could be tracked. And the first one popped while he was reconstructing his slug thrower's firing mechanism, which he had stripped for a cleaning the weapon had needed since the station breach. This was the particular irony of fieldcraft. The maintenance you delayed was always the maintenance you needed. He had the weapon reassembled in 40 seconds. Lanira was already at the tree line. 3 units, she said, without looking at him. Her ears were rotating independently, triangulating, approaching from the east declension, moving in a grid pattern. How do you? I can hear them. A pause. They are not built for this environment. The school correction officers were equipped for the ecological range of their own stations. Controlled atmosphere, hard surfaces, predictable geometry. The jungle moon offered none of these. Its undergrowth was dense and acoustically complex. Its humidity played havoc with the vibration-sensing patches that served the school as ears, and its light came from multiple bioluminescent sources at different frequencies, which confused the optical apparatus designed for artificial, uniform illumination. What the correction officers did have was a human-specific neuroparalytic, loaded into narrow-bore dispersal canisters, and the biological signature of a Terran insurgent to track. The first canister deployed at 200 meters. Duncan was already moving when the aerosol reached him. He caught the edge of the cloud rather than the center, which made the difference between immediate collapse and a slow, grinding onset. His proprioception wobbled. He compensated. His hands stayed functional. He put 2 slugs into the canopy above the deployment point, not to hit anything, but to move the correction officers out of their grid, force them to react rather than advance. It worked, briefly. The second canister caught him when he shifted position, and this one he caught more fully. His left leg informed him, in the calm clinical way of a nervous system beginning to drop its non-essential functions, that it was no longer interested in participating. He went to one knee behind a root buttress the width of a transport vehicle and checked his ammunition, 11 rounds, 3 charges, 1 pry bar. Lanira appeared beside him, moving from a direction he had not tracked her going. How many? He asked. 5. They have separated to flank. Can you run? She looked at him, really looked, the vertical slit pupils contracting in the bioluminescent light, and said, Can you? His right leg was starting to agree with his left. No, he said, not really. Duncan did not stop fighting when the toxin took his legs. He repositioned to a sitting brace against the root buttress, controlled his breathing down to the steady rhythm that kept his hands from shaking, and continued to work the bolt of his slug thrower with the mechanical patience of a man who had decided that stopping was someone else's option. He managed 2 more shots before his hands decided to weigh 40 pounds each. The school neuroparalytic was human-specific by design, developed according to the intelligence briefing Duncan had read before the mission, for efficient incapacitation of Terran insurgent elements with minimal collateral disruption to non-Terran subjects. A polite way of saying that it had been built to stop humans and nothing else. It worked on the nervous system the way a lock worked on a door. Not by breaking the mechanism, just by stilling it. His respiratory rate was dropping. He could feel it happening with the detached interest of someone observing a process they could not intervene in. Each breath a little shallower, the pause between them a little longer. His body heat, that persistent metabolic output that had warmed stolen shuttle cabins and fogged his breath in cold corridors, was beginning to drop for the first time in his adult life. Lanira was there when he could no longer hold the weapon. She caught it before it hit the ground. He was not sure when she had crossed the distance between them. The toxin had taken his ability to track fast movement, left him with a reduced frame rate on the world, but she was beside him with her hand on his chest, her touch careful in the way of someone relearning what touch meant. The respiratory depression, he said, or tried to say, it came out slower than he intended. It's not, I need you to know it's not permanent. If the compound's clear. I know, she said. He looked at her face. She was not afraid. He had learned enough of her grammar by now to read that much. What she was, instead, was arriving at something. He could watch the calculation completing behind those green, vertical slit eyes. The last output of a process that had been running since he had carried her out of a tank in a station built for silence. Lanira, he got her name out clearly, at least. You don't have to. They are still in the jungle, she said. Yes, they will come for you when you cannot respond. Probably. She set his weapon across his chest, where his unresponsive hands could theoretically still find it. Then she stood, and in the standing there was something that was not the careful, hyper-analytical movements he had seen since the tank, something that belonged to the Valari the school had spent months trying to subtract from her. Her ears rotated separately, independently cataloging every quadrant of the dark canopy above them. No one gets left behind, she said, and her voice had a trill underneath it, not the quiet, involuntary warmth he had heard in the shuttle. This one had edges. She moved into the jungle, and the dark took her like water taking a stone. Duncan breathed his shallow breaths and listened to the bioluminescent canopy creak above him, and he was not afraid, because the hunter was no longer the one in the trees. The jungle did not become quiet when Lanira entered it. It became a different kind of loud. She moved through the bioluminescent undergrowth at the level of the mid-canopy, 8 meters above the forest floor, where the interlocked branches were dense enough to support her weight and sparse enough to provide exit vectors in any direction she needed. The Valari were built for this geometry. The school correction officers were not. She could hear them in the way she could hear everything now, with the full range of her hearing restored. The jungle was a score she could read. The rustle of displacement where a 7-foot frame moved through leaf matter. The specific acoustic signature of school-issued equipment crossing a surface it had not been engineered for. The rhythm of a search pattern executed by beings who had planned this operation on hard floors and were now improvising in a medium that refused their parameters. There were 5 of them. The thing that had happened when she walked away from Duncan and into the tree line was not a decision so much as a realization. She had spent months, she did not know precisely how many, the sensory nullification had taken her temporal sense along with everything else, in a state of enforced analytical distance, stripped of the instincts the school classified as inefficient emotional variables. She had watched herself being taken apart and catalogued from the inside, a specimen submitting to its own vivisection because no alternative framework had been available. Duncan had provided an alternative framework. It was not that he had been kind exactly, though he had been in the specific way of someone who did not think kindness was a strategy, and therefore deployed it without calculation. It was that he had made a choice in a cold, collapsing facility with 8 minutes until correction officers arrived, and a mission objective that did not include her. And the choice he had made was to carry her. The school's social logic had no category for this. She had watched his expressive storm-gray eyes scanning for exits and still returning to her. She had felt his body heat as an anchor when nothing else in the world was familiar. She had heard him explain a tribal survival instinct. No one gets left behind. With the mild embarrassment of a being who knew it was irrational and had decided that rationality was someone else's business. The calculation she had arrived at, crouched in the canopy with 5 school correction officers moving in a grid below her, was very simple. He was Pack. He was incapacitated. She was not. She observed the nearest officer for 11 seconds. Building its movement model, its search grid was methodical, covering the ground in parallel lines spaced for their stride length, a pattern that assumed the subject of the search would be on the ground and would remain still. She dropped from the canopy and was behind it, before the vibration-sensitive skin patches on its back had finished registering the air displacement of her descent. The school were beings of order and category. They had filed Lanira under neutralized. She was updating the record. The second officer died because it moved toward the sound of the first one falling. This was the essential problem with grid search doctrine. In an environment that had a vertical axis, it assumed that whatever was removing units from the search would either flee or engage from the ground, and that approach vectors from above were unlikely because above required both the will and the capability to move through canopy at speed in the dark. Lanira had both. She also had Duncan's spare kinetic slugs, retrieved from the satchel he had let her take from his belt when she rose, a silent request answered with a silent grant. She used the slug thrower sparingly. It was loud, and the school would track sound. What she used instead, primarily, was elevation, patience, and the obsidian-hard retractable claws the school had thought to document in her intake file, but had apparently not cross-referenced with potential operational risk. The third officer had separated from its grid to investigate the absence of radio contact from the first two. School communication was vibration-based at short range, the skin patches again, which meant the jungle's ambient interference had been working against their coordination since the moment they entered the canopy. She heard the third one emitting query pulses into the dark, flat and rhythmic, waiting for a response that was not coming. She gave it a different kind of response. The fourth was harder. It had registered the anomaly and stopped moving, which was tactically sound. Stationary targets in complex terrain were difficult to locate from above, and it had its dispersal canister raised, which meant it was willing to deploy the neuroparalytic in a wide pattern regardless of what it hit. Lanira had no Terran nervous system for the toxin to target. She moved directly into the dispersal cloud and through it, reaching the officer before it could cycle for a second deployment. And the encounter was brief in the way that encounters are when one party has committed fully and the other has not yet revised its threat assessment. The fifth officer was running. She did not let it reach the direction it was running toward, which was Duncan. She moved through the upper canopy in a long, looping intercept arc, crossing the distance in the way a Valori crosses distance, when necessity has removed the instinct to hold back, in a series of controlled explosions, bioluminescent amber streaking across copper skin as she dropped between the officer and its objective. It stopped. It emitted a query tone, flat, synthesized, rhythmic, the exact frequency of a system encountering a variable that its models had not predicted. Lanira's voice, when she answered, carried the low trill that meant edges. "He is not yours anymore," she said, in the school's own synthesized frequency, a language she had learned in the tank. "He was never yours, and you have made the error of hunting what I protect." The jungle was quiet for exactly the length of time it took the fifth officer's threat assessment to complete. Then it was quiet for a different reason. Lanira stood in the dark canopy for a long moment after, her hearing still turned outward, cataloging every frequency for threats that no longer existed. The bioluminescence pulsed amber and green around her, indifferent and alive. Her claws retracted slowly. She turned back toward where she had left Duncan. Her pace, returning, was unhurried. The hunt was finished and the packmate was waiting, and those were the only two facts that mattered in this particular jungle on this particular dark morning. He woke to birdsong. Not birds. He doubted this moon had anything that qualified under a strict biological definition, but something in the middle canopy was producing a complex, rising series of tones as the ambient light shifted from full dark to the gray pre-dawn that was as close as this cloud-covered moon got to morning, and it sounded enough like birds that Duncan's body chose to interpret it that way, and release the muscle tension it had been holding since the toxin took him. He was propped against the root buttress where he had fallen. His jacket, which he had not had when consciousness left, was draped over him. His slug thrower was on the ground beside his right hand, loaded. Lanira was sitting in the fork of the root buttress above him, 3 feet overhead, her digitigrade legs folded and her copper-toned arms resting on her knees. She was watching the canopy with the specific quality of attention that was not anxious scanning, but post-completion monitoring, checking the environment after the work was done. Duncan ran a systems check on himself. His hands responded. His legs, after a moment of negotiation, agreed to exist. His proprioception was unsteady, but present. The toxin had cleared through his metabolic system, burning off through the same high-output biology that had always run him a degree warmer than the galactic average. "The correction officers?" he asked. "Gone," she said. "Retreated?" She looked down at him then, and the quality of her regard was the same one she had turned on him in the shuttle when he had explained the pack bond rule, trying to categorize something that did not fit the available categories. "No," she said. "He absorbed this. All 5 of them. You had 11 rounds remaining. I used 4. Duncan looked at the sky through the canopy, the amber and green bioluminescence fading as the gray light strengthened, and tried to find the words for what he was feeling, and found, characteristically, that the feeling was simpler than the words would have been. "Thank you," he said. She descended from the root fork with the quiet, unhurried grace of something that had always known how to do this, and had simply been prevented. She settled beside him, closer than the space required, and the warmth that moved between them was partly his metabolic output, doing what it always did, and partly something that had no biological taxonomy. "You carried me," she said, "through the door, through the tunnel, all of it. Yes, you did not know who I was. Didn't need to." The trill when it came was not the quiet, involuntary warmth of the shuttle, and not the edged vibration of the hunt. It was something that had not existed in either register until now. Low and melodic and continuous, the sound of a category being revised. She was not prey, she was not specimen. She was not neutralized subject. She was pack. The jungle moon turned slowly under its cloud cover, and the bioluminescent canopy went on doing what it had always done, cycling through amber and green and the deep, indifferent blue of something alive that does not need permission to be. And below it, in the shelter of a root buttress large enough to be a wall, a human insurgent and a Valari predator sat in the specific quiet of two beings who have decided, without needing to discuss it further, that they are not done yet. The rim was wide, the skull had a long reach but a slow one, built for methodical coverage rather than pursuit of targets who had stopped following known vectors. They would move on soon. For now, the morning was enough. For now, this was enough. And that brings us to the end of today's story. Thanks for taking the time to listen. I really appreciate it. This channel is all about original, human-focused science fiction, and every story is presented as a part of a larger collection. If you'd like to continue, there's an